We acknowledge that the Algonquin to Adirondack region is land for which the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations have been and continue to be responsible since time immemorial. We are grateful for the opportunity to acknowledge and express our gratitude to the First Nations who host us in their territories. We acknowledge that the relationship of these people to the land has been based on kinship rather than on dominion over the land. We wish to continue to learn from and with the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples so that we may also understand and fulfill our responsibilities to the land. We are especially grateful for the guidance and teaching from First Nations leaders such as Henry Lickers and Larry McDermott, who guided the A2A collaborative in our formative years, helping us to create our constitution and our strategic plans. We acknowledge that humans are part of nature and that our first responsibility is to live in harmony within it, respecting the animals and plants as kin, and recognizing that the animals and plant beings are important, both to themselves and to the whole. They have communities and interrelationships of their own and with humans, which need to be taken fully into account. Let us dedicate ourselves today to making decisions that embody respect and gratitude to the land and to all its creatures.
Very happy to be here. My name is Helena, and I am Wasabidasu Sekre. I am the knowledge keeper in residence here at St. Lawrence College. I'm very honored that you're asking me to be and do this opening. I brought a couple rattles I've been working on for gifts I'm giving to a couple people, and I still have to adorn them, but I thought maybe I could try them out here this morning with you guys a little bit and listen to these rattles. So they are rawhide. One thing that I like to do within some things I've been doing in my land-based training is making a rawhide from the deer, and a lot of the deer that I might get would be up there in the Ardoch Nation, and people that I know on Snow Road and such help me to get skins, and also our supplier, Bill Shepherd there in just north of Verona, and Randy, and all the people that have been working with here. And so this is a callback song. And so Anishinaabe Quayin down Bukpang. So I am from Batchewana First Nations. I am Ojibwe specific to the Anishinaabe people. So in Anishinaabe we say Ani, because that is hello, because it's the first part of Anishinaabe. And we also say Bojo because in the creation story it starts out first man, he then gains fire, and he gets his name Anishinaabe from his grandmother. And then in natural world, when he walks, he becomes Wena Bojo. So people will say Bojo to first time greetings to elders. Ani Bojo,
Ani Bojo,
Mino Gijigat,
Mino Gijigat,
Imino Ayana,
Mino Ayana,
Mino Ayana. Louder, louder. Ani Bojo,
Ani Bojo,
Mino Gijigat,
Mino Gijigat,
Imino Ayana,
Mino Ayana,
Mino Ayana.
Mino Ayana.
Awesome. Okay, so you can be a friend and you go, how you doing? And the second one, you could be ugly, like Sabe. And the third one, you could be a wolf. What does a wolf say? Owl. Right. The Oscabeowis story. And the Oscabeowis is the helper. And the helper is chosen by the Creator. And I would ask this feather here to help me with the story. And I went to, used to do work with FNTI too, and there's a beautiful woman there, Betty Miracle, who helped me. And she ran a session one day that I attended, and there's a break in this feather, and the top of the feather, how you come out. So I am, on how the feather is born, and it's a whole beautiful workshop, but this break, really means something. So when we as Anishinaabe people, we believe in the circle and the bundle, and so do schools. And what I've come to know is that we gather in different ways. So the Oscabelis is told by the Creator to go and to choose somebody to receive the 7 grandfather teachings. And so he does, he goes out and he chooses a baby boy. And he's still feeding on his mother's breast. And that night he goes to his lodge and he sees the baby sleeping there on a pale board and the parents are sleeping by him, and he takes the baby and he leaves tobacco and he leaves a piece of the baby's clothing. And he takes that baby to the Medeoan lodge where the 7 grandfathers are sitting. And the grandfathers, they say to the Oscabelis, "That's a baby. He's innocent, he knows nothing. He can't yet stand. You take him back for the first 7 years and you're going to teach him everything you know, and then you bring him back here." And so he did, and he brought him back to the Medeoan lodge, but now he's a 7-year-old boy. And in front of them, they put a wooden drum about as high as this table here, wooden frame and covered with deerskin. And then they opened up that vessel, and each one of them reached inside and rubbed something on that little boy's back. And they told him everything about what each one of those teachings would mean. You know, the wisdom of the beaver, the humility of the wolf, the love of the eagle, the truth of the turtle, respect of the buffalo, the courage of the bear, and I believe Sabe, your honesty teaching. And now, and they tell him, and time goes on, 7 years for 7 teachings. He's 50 years old now, from a baby to a boy to a man. And he has this bundle on his back. And he goes back to his community, and at the edge of the community, he sees a very old couple. And they begin to cry, and they embrace each other. And he reaches in his bundle, and he gives them his love. And he continues on into his community, and he reaches into that bundle, and he starts saying, here's some of my music. Here's my humility. Here is my truth. So I hope for today this is some things that you're going to be receiving through this symposium. And when I meet up with you at the end of the day, that you have gathered things that I have gathered in my life. So we wish for asking me to come here. And thank you and welcome to St. Lawrence College. You're all so quiet now. We wish.
My name is Gary Bell. I'm a member of the board of A2A, formerly with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, now retired. As I was in Kingston last night, and when I was driving home back onto Wolf Island, which is like driving into a different world. You leave downtown Kingston, and the next minute you're in this remote community. And our first warm night, and the road was covered with frogs. First time for the season for us. And it made me think of why we're here. It also made me think of what would you call her, our patron saint of music for A2A, Sarah Harmer, and her song, Little Frogs. Because I'm immensely grateful for the Little Frogs and all the other things that we work to make connections for as kind of our life's work. Conservation is not a job. Conservation is something you do. It's something you hold in here. It's something that you're dedicated to. For me, it's something I can't imagine what else I would have done with my life. It's why I'm here. And I think conservation is especially because of the world we live in, conservation is the most selfish thing you can do. And conservation is the most selfless thing you can do. So conservation is what you should do. And so welcome to all of you who have decided that conservation is what you do. I should say, hi, how are you? Welcome to the Algonquin Adirondacks second biennial symposium 4 years later. We're so happy you can be here to share what you do and why you're doing it and how you're doing it. And so speaking of people who are dedicated to conservation and who this is what they do, Megan Quinn, I had the great pleasure of hiring Megan Quinn a few years ago before I left.
I hired you twice.
I hired you twice, that's right, I hired her twice. Now Megan comes from Yorkshire, England, from the industrial heartland of northern England. And she says it wasn't until she came to Canada that she realized that what she wanted to do was conservation. She had no concept of it in England, and she came here. She went to Sir Sanford Fleming, got her certificate in conservation, conservation technology or something like that, and did a number of conservation type things in the nonprofit world and came to us at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I should say came to them because I'm not there anymore. And became the conservation coordinator for Eastern Ontario, where she does all kinds of wonderful things like monitoring and inventorying of the lands that we protect. But since joining NCC, Megan has also become a great mentor of young conservationists and is on the IUCN, I'm going to get this one wrong too, but an IUCN panel for young conservationists and mentoring young conservationists. And Megan had the great fortune to be at COP15 representing NCC in their youth delegation. And so I think that's kind of a good introduction to Megan, why she can tell you why she's here, but why she's here and why she's going to introduce our keynote speaker, Megan Quinn.
Wow, Gary, that was such a lovely introduction. I don't think I've ever gotten an introduction to an introduction before, but I love that. Again, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to introduce this morning's keynote speaker. I actually met Dawn Carr as a fellow co-worker at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and I wanted to open this today by telling you about the first conversation that Dawn and I ever had. It went something like this. She said, "OMG Megan, you are amazing. I'd love to get to know you better and help sort out opportunities for further growth." And that was in response to a very long, rambling email I sent to Dawn out of the blue, essentially asking her, how do I make my career goals come true? And you can't see it, but this letter is full of capital letters and exclamation marks, and it's one of my favorite emails I've ever received in my life. I printed it out and put it on my desk. Because I'm going to talk about some amazing, wonderful achievements that Dawn has had in her career, but I wanted to start just by sharing how passionate she is about helping other people grow their careers as well, and I think that is such a lovely quality to have in a person. As Director of Strategic Conservation at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, Dawn is accelerating conservation impact by integrating and expanding the role of private and community land conservation partnerships into national and international dialogues. Prior to joining NCC, Dawn was the first woman to hold the position of Executive Director for the Canadian Parks Council, where she advised senior executives in Canada's federal, provincial and territorial park agencies and led initiatives to expand and support a pan-Canadian parks and protected area community. With over 20 years of experience, Dawn's passion extends into volunteer roles on 2 IUCN commissions and board and advisory positions with the Canadian National Committee for the IUCN, which I sit on the Young Professionals Committee of, Gary. That was good. You got the gist of it. Dawn also holds a Masters of Public Administration from Queen's University, focused on environmental policy and community development, and a Master of Arts and undergraduate degree from the University of Waterloo. Dawn was recognised by the Canadian Parks Council with the 2021 Individual Award of Excellence for her exemplary contribution to Canada's parks community during her executive director tenure. And recently, as a member of the Canadian delegation at the UN's Biodiversity Conference, COP15, Dawn Carr helped my dreams come true by helping to pitch and attending COP15 as part of the Nature Conservancy of Canada's youth delegation. I'm so proud to call her a co-worker, a mentor, and a friend. Please join me in welcoming Dawn Carr.
Hello, everyone. I'm now very conscious of using my excitement in a talk, because I do write that way. I get very excited. But this is a keynote, and it's the morning, and I see many of you have had coffee, so I hope to keep that energy up. But before I begin what I was hoping to share with you today, I really want to thank Emily and Helena. I'm not sure where you went, Helena, but thank you so much for opening us up in a good way, and for connecting us to where we are today with the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. I'll share with you a little bit about where I'm from, and I'm hoping today, because I'm now so inspired by what Gary's words were and the wonderful Megan Quinn, who I've just come to love over the past year and a half since working with NCC. I want to get you to know me a little bit. A lot of these conversations and keynotes can get technical, but I think what you will recognize, and what I think all of you feel in this room today, is that conservation really is about relationships. And so in this talk around collaborating for corridors in our, that word's on purpose, our post-COP15 world, I'm going to spend a little bit of time taking you through a bit of my career, why my perspective is the way that it is, and then moving into a conversation about COP15 and then the importance of collaboration as we move forward. And I've got lots of examples to share. So this is where I'm from. A few of you have asked me already today, where are you from? Where do you live? I live right on the outskirts of A2A. But I'm going to build in some street cred into my background here. But so I live, and I'm happy to live on the traditional territory of the Mississauga peoples and the Chippewan First Nations, and both are collectively known as the Williams Treaties First Nations. And it's an absolutely extraordinarily beautiful place to live. The Kawartha Highlands are in there, and it is right on the edge of A2A, and everything people in this room are working so hard to connect and protect. So there's 3 things I'm going to walk you through today. And I alluded to this a little bit, but the first thing I really want to do is share with you the growth of the conservation community over the past 30 years. And there's a reason why I'm kind of honing in on a 30-year period. I'm going to take you through that both from a personal perspective, but also professionally, and the history of how the conservation community has grown internationally and why it matters today in the lead up to COP15. So, and then I'm going to focus in on connectivity, ecological corridors, and how they played a role in what came out of COP15 with the global biodiversity framework. I'm going to walk you through this with the expectation that nobody needs to know anything about this, but I'm sure many of you know more than I do. So hopefully by the end of this conversation, we'll all be on the same page, because the third point is what I feel so strongly about now. As I've gotten to know your work in A2A and the many different organizations that contribute to the work that A2A is working to achieve, I am so sure, and I know that the model that corridors and the work of ecological connectivity play is the way of the future. You model collaboration in so many ways, and there's a lot that can be learned from that. So those are the 3 pieces of my talk, and I'm going to talk about it from the past, the present, and the future. So now you have a sense as to where we're going. So Megan has alluded to this a little bit, but I wanted to share my journey, part of my journey. Those 3 circles represent where my career got started. I've worked with Ontario Parks, Parks Canada, Alberta Parks, and I spent a better part of a decade working with the Canadian Parks Council. This is a photo of me. I had to connect with my parents to get them to dig into their photo albums to find this picture. This was taken in 1992. I'm going to be very vulnerable and honest, connect to those 7 teachings throughout my talk. So I was 16 years old here, 1992. And it was my first summer job and worked with Ontario Parks. And it was on the, I was based in South River as a junior ranger, and I cleared portage trails on the western edge of Algonquin Provincial Park. It was the most glorious summer I've ever spent. I grew up in Toronto. I had never really left the city. I was like one of those concrete kids, and my name got pulled out of a hat, which is what the program was all about. And you can only do it when you're 16. And so I thought, well, I could either be a lifeguard at an amusement center in Toronto, or I could only do this once. So I decided to leave the city, and I spent the summer doing this job. And it changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my career, connecting to nature in that way, and the people that I spent that summer with. So as my career moved along and I went to school and I continued to become more and more passionate about protected areas, you may recognize this bridge. I worked for, at the time, it was St. Lawrence Islands National Park. So I think there's some Parks Canada colleagues in here that work for Thousand Islands National Park now. So this is going back to 2003. Every summer I had a job working in a protected area or a park all through my university career. And I was a visitor attendance study. I went and I had a little tin boat and I boated around all the islands and I met the visitors and they gave me iced tea and I had some cookies and I learned who visits these places and why. So really fond memories. This is the bridge that takes you from Ivy League, Canada to Alexandria Bay in the United States. So learned about some of the connectivity issues there and the connections between countries. I then really started my real job with Alberta Parks, and it was there that I toured that province and got to understand connectivity very deeply, having spent a lot of time in the Kananaskis Valley, Canmore, and I believe you had my colleague Erin Jacobs talk to you last year about her experience in working with A2A. So I think or it was last year, I think that you had her, yeah. So this work with the Canadian Parks Council, it was really interesting in that, from a collaboration perspective, it took me, out of being in the field and working at a policy level with different governments trying to find areas of common concern and to negotiate what projects we're going to work on collectively together that matter. And so it comes down to people, even at that level, in terms of understanding what are the political priorities of the day for these different jurisdictions, how might we advance some of these common issues in a way that matter on the ground. And it was a really wonderful and extraordinary experience. Through that work, I brought some examples because it really goes to show how collaboration matters in all sorts of different ways. Connecting Canadians with Nature was a whole initiative that was led in Canada because there was a recognition that people were disconnecting from nature and it was having implications on many of the budgets that were being dedicated to conservation, parks and protected areas in Canada. This also was a huge issue in the United States as well. And I know that both the directors, the chiefs within Parks Canada and the National Park Service were advancing this cause together. We also worked on connecting intergenerational and youth to nature through the establishment of the Nature Playbook, which was written by young professionals and experienced professionals together, really looking at diversity. And then this was a whole initiative, and I really delved deeply into collaboration here. It was parks and protected areas, really, for all. How do we all connect and contribute to this work together? And I got to understand and meet many different people working in various ways and in various organizations. This work also exposed me to working internationally with the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, attending world congresses and representing what Canada is doing in this space. Worked well and hard with the National Park Service and others, and got to know America's State Parks and the National Association of State Park Directors. Our community is huge. There are so many people working for the same cause, and it makes me think about that why that Gary introduced this morning. Like, why are you in this line of work? What is connecting your heart and mind and drives you every day to get up and make that difference? I know when I was young, my why was very different from what it is today. That 16-year-old in me, I was like, my why was I'm getting out of the city, I'm gonna make friends, and I'm gonna have fun. That was it. But as my understanding, deep understanding now of conservation and its significance and importance to our world, my why is shifting over the course of time. This is a big part of the shift of my why. In 2016, the Canadian Parks Council initiated what was called the Pathway to Canada Target 1. It's not well known, I would say, outside of Canada, so maybe this is something our American colleagues and friends in the room is new. But this was our connection to what was driving the Convention for Biological Diversity's last set of targets around protected and conserved areas. In my own files, this body of work is still called a working group, and it exploded into something much, much bigger. I did bring these documents that you see up here if you want to take a look, because they've been very instrumental in trying to design and express and explain and guide how Canada is working toward increasing our ability to protect and conserve nature. I want to focus in on part of this talk because it was the first time I was exposed to deeply understanding and connecting the importance of understanding different ways of knowing. And I think now, whenever we start a conference and I hear the gratitude in words that are expressed through elders and Indigenous colleagues such as Helena, like it changes the way I present what I share and how I listen during the day. And it was a colleague that said, where do you begin to tell someone that their way of knowing the world isn't the only way? And it was a profound statement to me because at the time, I had never thought of that. And it's very obvious to me now, but I think when we live deeply in a culture that kind of shows the way of the world in a sense, there was some humility that was brought into our work in the Pathway to Canada Target 1 and an intentional effort to work in partnership with Indigenous colleagues to understand how we might braid and bring our work together in a good way. So this concept of ethical space, and I've got the wampum belt that you see at the bottom there, just shows that there are different cultures, different ways of knowing, and we worked separate from one another, knowing that there is ethical space in between us. I now find myself in NCC. I'm hoping this journey is going to give you some sense as to like how I'm experiencing, so far my career and why I'm just loving expanding my network because it's helping me improve, and all of my colleagues, I think, improve what it means to collaborate and why it matters. NCC, I was just blown away with the different kinds of partners that privately protected area organizations, NGOs work with to get the job done. 2 weeks ago, I was meeting with the Canadian Cattle Association because they're true conservationists in many ways about working with cattle and grazing the land so that our native prairie grasslands can thrive and flourish. These are people that I didn't realize I would work with, and they're absolutely extraordinarily wonderful people. So this is just, you can't read it, but it just kind of shows the explosion of new partners that I'm learning are important to collaborate with. It's like, they call it strategic inquiry about, you think about the project you're working on and you start thinking about who might be the audience of people I could be working with. Also within NCC, and Megan alluded to this, I've been able to help represent the voice and grow the voice and importance of NGOs, private, civil society, contributions to the work of the Convention for Biological Diversity and how they play a major role in achieving outcomes. And this is a quote I'm going to read to you because this is where I don't think we have elevated enough the significance and importance of civil society actions in the work that is happening across the landscape around conservation. This is a study that was just published on March 9th, but the conclusion really is we find that compared to publicly owned and managed protected lands, protected private lands, including conservation easements, are more often in areas designated as high conservation priority, hold significantly higher means of species richness, and sequester more vulnerable land-based carbon per unit area. These and related findings highlight the necessity of mechanisms that engage private landholders in enduring conservation partnerships. More and more research is coming out every day that talks about these different relationships in land authorities on the ground and how to bring them together. So over this whole course of my career, I'm learning that conservation is about relationships. And it's not just people, it's relationships with the land, the richness of life. This is why we are doing our work. Just in a napkin summary, when we're thinking about what counts towards some of these big international targets, there are protected areas, and many of you may have seen this acronym, which is a struggle to say sometimes, but it's Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures, which is OECMs. So protected areas are, what you think about with national, provincial parks, many easements, privately protected areas. They must conserve in situ biodiversity, and they may conserve connectivity. OECMs are places where the primary purpose is not conservation, but through their management of these lands, they create conservation outcomes, biodiversity conservation outcomes. IPCAs, Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, could be either a protected area or an OECM. There's very specific criteria looking at those things. But protected areas and OECMs, those designations and recognitions are the only thing that count toward this 30 by 30, these biodiversity goals, which is interesting to know. And then ecological corridors, and I'm going to lead in and sort of really lean into the idea that they need to, and they are absolutely increasing their relevance, and they're showing up in conversations and stories at very senior ways and all throughout organizations more so than they ever have before. But this is really the crux of where I'm coming from. These governance models here, there's government, there's private and civil society, Indigenous peoples and local communities, and then this shared box. These are defined IUCN governance types. They're the only things that can help work toward and count protected and conserved areas. I want to focus in on this because, I've observed over time we're used to working within governments. We're used to, understanding and growing the prevalence and importance of raising the voice of Indigenous-led conservation. There is a role, absolutely, of private and civil society action in conservation. And then there's this really powerful area that is left to, I believe, expand and explode at the bottom, which is in shared governance. How we work together to advance outcomes. Because the special characteristics and qualities that a government can bring to the table, or civil society and private NGOs can bring to the table, and Indigenous-led conservation, they're different. They're uniquely different ways, and they have different tools for conserving the land. So if we all get together and build some of those shared outcomes, they can be even more powerful, and it's happening. Many of you in this room are doing that kind of work. So this brings me to 2022. And this was just last year, so the Conference of the Parties for the Convention for Biological Diversity took place in Montreal in December. Before I dive into that, I'm going to spend very briefly a few minutes explaining what occurred in the past 20 or 30 years that has caused a shift in the urgency that we're seeing at COP15. So remember I was 16 in 1992? Back in 1992, that was the very first Earth Summit. It came out of the Brundtland Commission report in 1987, which is about our common future. There was a recognition around sustainable development that we need to change the way that we operate on this Earth because we're witnessing changes that are not consistent with living sustainably on the land. So the Rio Convention took place in Rio de Janeiro. Some of you may recall this, and there were three significant bodies of work that came out of that. The UN Convention for Biological Diversity was one of them. The UNFCCC around climate change was created, and so too was the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. Those three bodies of work, which are led under the United Nations Environment Program, were designed to tackle the twin crises that we see today around biodiversity loss and climate change. And they underpin the Sustainable Development Goals. If you read, the Sustainable Development Goals, all of them cannot be achieved without first really diving in deep with resolving some of the issues around climate change and biodiversity loss. So it's all connected. It all started in 1992. And you can see we've got a number of multilateral environmental agreements. I've just got two circles at the bottom because the Climate Change and Biodiversity Convention started really close together in 1992. The United Nations Desertification Convention followed just a couple of years later. But you can just see the significance and the number of countries that have joined these conventions has grown over time. There's 196 countries that are parties to the UN Convention for Biodiversity now. And interestingly, the only two that are not signed is the Holy See, the Vatican, and the United States. The United States signed on but has not ratified yet their membership to the CBD. But I would say that there is a commitment for sure. I'm really focusing on one of these targets, which is around 30 by 30 that has been kind of brought forward over the course of time. There is a commitment by both countries to move forward on that, which I will get to. So these are the three goals within the within the CBD. I will use that acronym now. And they're not prioritized in any order. It's been spoken about how they are all being achieved together. But the first is to conserve nature, biological diversity. The second is to sustain the use of its components. And then the third is, I really love this one, around the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from genetic resources or that arise from nature itself. So that's the whole intention globally around this huge effort that 196 countries are a party to. The last set of targets were called the Aichi targets. And they were created in 2010 in Aichi, Japan. And these targets are ones that all countries commit to helping to move and advance on. This Aichi Target 11 is in here. It was focused on protected areas. And this does work within, I'm going to lead into this about how this all connects with you and the work that's happening around ecological connectivity. But this was the former goal. It was 17% we were going to protect of our biological diversity globally by 2020. And it's also the first time that a lot of these qualitative elements showed up in the targets. So, which is like that places are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative, and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective conservation measures. So this is really what started a lot of the focus around what does connectivity mean then? If that's in the target, we have to better understand it. But how did we do? So I'm still leading up to 2022. How did we do? I think we all know that there's a lot more work to be done. And that transformation about how we live on the land needs to occur. And what was quite disheartening to many people is that only 6 of the world's 20 goals were partially achieved in that last decade. So this is mounting pressure on COP15, the next global biodiversity framework. How can we assure and change what comes out of this convention to try and create the change we know that we need to see? There was also a recognition in the lead up to COP15 that more and substantial contributions and alignment need to occur with Indigenous peoples internationally. And it was the executive secretary of the CBD made an explicit statement that it is central to this effort. That kind of dialogue had not occurred before. It was also mounting pressure coming politically and from economic systems. There's the High Ambition Coalition, which is made up now of over 100 countries that are all committing to the importance of achieving these conservation goals. There's the G7 2030 Nature Compact, which signed on to 30 by 30. Leaders Pledge for Nature and Business for Nature is an organization made up of 80 prominent international organizations that are all pushing for more ambition around these nature targets. So why 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of Earth's biological diversity by 2030? Why? It's because evidence is coming out that 125 trillion, that's the annual value of services provided by nature. It was difficult to understand the value of nature to our way of living until, just within the past decade, the kind of research that's coming out. There's now values being placed on it. 1/3, this is huge, just showing the connection between the biodiversity loss crisis we're facing and climate change. 1/3 is the contribution that nature can contribute to climate change mitigation and efforts. That's a significant amount. 2.6 billion tons. There's a lot of information here. That's the amount of carbon that forests absorb. But this last one, which really ties in with the issues facing ecological integrity, is 60%. This number is high. That's the amount of wildlife that has disappeared in the past 50 years. 60%. That have this but on the bottom. Because we know that when nature is protected and conserved, life comes back. And I saw Helena's skirt she was wearing this morning, which had bison on the skirt as keystone species. I love this image. Parks Canada has brought back bison into Banff National Park, and they've thrived. Nature Conservancy of Canada, on Old Man on His Back, there's a conserved area in Saskatchewan where we're bringing keystone species to help manage and protect the beautiful native grasslands that exist. Grasslands are the most threatened ecosystem on the earth. So there's a recognition that we know life comes back when things are protected and conserved and connected. But what's the scale of the challenge? I put in here lines to show where we're at, both in Canada and the US and globally. But if we're working towards protecting 30% of our globe by 2030, we're just where these lines are right now. We're just hovering, we're just below 15%. We got a long way to go, both countries and globally. This map I love. I think anybody that works in this kind of field, we all love maps. We like to be able to see it. This is pretty much live. There's a website called Protected Planet, and it's what monitors all of the currently recognized and designated protected and conserved areas globally. So this is a snapshot of April. And you can see just the different colors that exist here and how beautiful they are, both marine and terrestrial protected and conserved areas. And those are managed, as I said, by those governance types. The government, public, Indigenous, private, including NCC lands and others, and shared governance. This is what I find really interesting when looking at governance and who actually has land authority, is that blue part of the circle. It's subnational governments, states and provinces that contribute to what counts in their protected and conserved area systems. The second largest contributor from a governance perspective are nonprofit organizations. That's huge. I just don't think that people know this. We think of our amazing national parks and it's part of the federal system. That is the third area, is the federal or national ministry of agency. So it just shows to me the weight and significance of the work that's taking place among civil society and NGOs to create the change and difference we need to see. And then these other smaller slivers, when I'm looking at that, it's around joint governance, Indigenous people, and some for-profit organizations that are changing the way they do business to better recognize and conserve nature. It is those slivers that I believe we are going to start seeing a huge expansion in the contribution that they're playing as part of the solution. Going back to this map, I mean, we're over here, but this is where ecological connectivity takes place. The problem with this map is that you'll see there's a lot of green blobs and blue ones, but none of them, many are not connected. And this is the importance of connectivity. And this was 2020 figures, but only 10% of the world's parks and protected areas right now are connected. If things are not connected, it's not helping the issue. Parks and protected areas cannot do it on their own. They're not islands. They're not intended to help create a bubble around the species and abundance of life that needs nature to survive, and that includes our involvement in those spaces. So we need to connect them. As you know, I'm totally speaking to the choir. You guys are so much smarter about this than I am, for sure. But it's this idea about, not paying attention to the bigger picture has really big consequences. And I share that thought with a lot of my colleagues. I think Aaron Jacobs is somebody that we've talked a lot about, like making sure we look at the big picture so that we don't miss out on opportunities to make an even bigger impact. My why starts to evolve and change again about why I'm doing this work is to start looking at bigger pictures. Now, COP15, all of this really helped to create some of the momentum and desire and the loss of patience among a lot of people to want to see very concrete measures within the next global biodiversity framework so that we don't feel that sense of disappointment at the end of this decade like we did at 2020. What led up to 2022 was a lot of work. There were a lot of meetings. I was part of the Canadian delegation helping to represent and work with Environment Climate Change Canada and their negotiations to get sort of the best draft leading into COP15. Which took place in Montreal, which we didn't know was going to take place in Montreal until June 28th of last year. So it's absolutely extraordinary the amount of work that took place in 6 months to bring the world to Canada to have this conversation about the next global biodiversity framework. So this really was the purpose of it, an ambitious plan with broad-based action to bring about a transformation in society's relationship. Again, this word relationship in society's relationship with biodiversity. The draft included 21 targets for governments, the parties that signed on to the Convention for Biological Diversity, to meet at the end of the decade. And they included many different things, including this idea of conserving 30% of the world by 2030. The overall mission is to to stop biodiversity loss by 2030. It's 7.5 years away right now, but we're going to stop biodiversity loss. That is the mission. And long term, and I heard Helena, or I think it might have been you, Emily, talk about living in harmony with nature. That is the 2050 vision, is to achieve full recovery by 2050, and we are living in harmony with nature. What came out of COP15 wasn't 21 targets, but 23 targets. And I've just highlighted them in just a couple of words under each so you can get a sense of the diversity of issues that are covered within this framework. When we're talking about ecological connectivity, you see it showing up in the first 3 targets around land and sea use change, which is around spatial planning. How do we connect these places and start understanding and knowing what is actually on the ground and how it's being managed? Target 2 was very specifically around ecosystem restoration, and it has the wording right within that target around connected systems and using restoration to help support that. Target 3 was, and it was up until sort of the last minute, nobody was sure whether or not 30, the number 30 as a target, was actually going to make it into the agreement, and it did. So that's quantitative measure is the 30. But equally or more so important are the qualitative elements that are in this target, which talk about connectivity, representativeness, and other elements that if you didn't have those effectiveness measures, how we actually deliver on these targets, it doesn't matter. They need to be connected, they need to be effective, they need to be representative. That's all built into that target. And then target 12 is around urban planning and the importance of connecting both, urban green spaces together, but also people to these green and blue spaces that really matter. So these are the targets. Connectivity, ecological corridors. One thing I wanted to highlight here is what came out of COP15 in the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is different, is that it's also accompanied by a monitoring framework. This didn't exist in 2012. So the monitoring framework, it now gives measures that help track progress, the country's progress around targets and goals. This drives countries and those that are responsible for this work to collaborate with others within those areas to understand how we measure our progress. Because ultimately, in Canada, and it's, I can't recall the organization in the United States, but there's, it's probably the Bureau for Land Management, I'm gonna get that wrong, but who is the state representative to the CBD, they gotta deliver and start talking about annually and at these next COPs, like the progress that's being made. We have a monitoring framework that can help us do that now. Right now, there is not a headline indicator for connectivity, but I understand that one will be proposed at the next COP that is going to help us really target in and understand, like, what does connectivity look like and how do we understand its progress at sort of this level easier, which is great. Who here attended COP15? I know Megan did. Did anybody else have the opportunity to go? Because I just wanted to give, did you? It wasn't just about negotiations. There were a lot of negotiations happening, but there was a huge space with a lot of people attending. And it was really nice to see the diversity of voices that were there from, and this goes to the governance types again. There were governments, there were civil society there were businesses and corporations, Indigenous-led conservation. And you just got this sense from a Canadian and North American perspective that there's a shift happening where it's not just, the hardcore environmentalists that are pushing this movement. There is a real recognition that change needs to happen, and it's being driven by different voices. I found that incredibly inspiring. I was in the room at 3:33 in the morning when the Global Biodiversity Framework was signed, and this is a 13-second video that you can sort of see what happened there. That's me saying, amazing! I was tired. But it was an amazing moment. 3:30, like all those people, we all sat around and waited for the negotiators to come back, not knowing whether or not a deal was going to be made or not. But what resulted was a lot of ambition remained in the agreement. It actually, honestly, having been part of those discussions for years and years, I felt really proud of the work that had happened and what has landed in this agreement. It gives me hope for what we can achieve moving forward. But this, I want to get back to my why. And I'm going back to 1992 when I was 16 years old. So, Megan, we talk about youth leadership happening and the voices of intergenerational connections that are occurring in these discussions. This here is my daughter. She's 16. So in 1992, when the Rio Conventions happened and the Convention for Biodiversity was born, I was 16. This past December, I had the privilege of seeing my own daughter, who's 16, raising her voice to share her desire to see change. And that's my why now. I'm really deeply understanding what sustainable development means. The definition around how we need to live on planet Earth in a way that keeps it intact and remain viable for all those that come after us. My why is different. It's different now. I'm waking up every day wanting to do the work I'm doing because it matters. It really matters. And I know all of you have stories like this too, but the why changes over the course of one's career. So back to this, collaboration is totally key to success. I can't not think about these governance types now. We don't think about it. In Canada, the way that we set up the Pathway to Canada Target 1 process only included at the highest level 2 governance types. It was between public governments and Indigenous leadership, which is really important, how our federation is built. But the voice of civil society and the work that is happening amongst NGOs and private land and the citizens and those of us that live and love and want to play and learn on the land, we need to raise up and be part of that solution and understand where shared governance comes into play. This is the power of shared governance, I think, is when there are processes in place that can enable all of us to start talking about the special contributions we each can create to make the outcomes have impact. So when it comes to COP15 and collaboration, what nobody talks about is Section C of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We talk about the targets. It's what I've talked about while I've been here. And we talk about, some of these measures, but this is my favorite section in the Global Biodiversity Framework. If you go to the CBD website and you actually read the agreement, this is what's going to change the world, is Section C, which is the implementation considerations. There's many of them there that are noted about how we need to work together to see the change that we want to and need to see occur. But this is the wording that's in Section C, part of it. This is a framework for all, for the whole of government and the whole of society. Its success requires political will and recognition at the highest levels of government and relies on action and cooperation at all levels of government and by all actors of society. There's equity in this statement. There's equality that's written into it. This is an implementation consideration, whether you're working at really high macro levels or whether you're just working very specifically on a project. This is a consideration you need to make. Who are the voices that can contribute to helping to support connectivity, protected and conserved areas in the places that you live, learn, work, and play? Who are those voices? And let's not limit ourselves to our own assumptions about who should be around the table. Think big, think broadly, think intergenerationally, think across sectors, different levels of government. We all have to be part of the solution, and if we're excluding some voices, we are not going to be working toward the kind of outcomes that will have the most effectiveness, I believe. And I think it's this kind of explosion in thinking that is our way of the future, and it 100% relies on collaboration and open-mindedness to collaboration. I didn't know much about A2A before kind of thinking about what it was I was going to talk about today. I've heard, great stories. I've lived, I've worked within the A2A region. You guys have it down. I was looking and reading about who's involved in A2A. You are working in this way already. There's so much that can be learned from the work that you do, and I'm so excited to sit in on the sessions today to hear very specifically about some of those projects. Thank you for the work that you're doing. My Parks Canada colleagues, Mara, who I've worked with over the years, we were talking about Parks Canada's work around ecological corridors. I sat in on the Ministers' Roundtable. There's 5 themes that are looked at every 2 years. The minister investigates them. One of the themes this year was on ecological corridors, which says to me, federally, that corridors ecological connectivity is having an impact in the way we're thinking about creating the change. It's not just about establishing and recognizing protected and conserved areas. They have to be connected. So that's really promising. I'm also learning, I reached out to colleagues in Quebec, and I'm learning all about Quebec's, I'm sorry for the typo though, Quebec's Ecological Corridor Initiative. We've got a great talk. Oh, and I haven't even had the opportunity to meet yet. We've got Marie-Andre, are you in my colleague? She's going to be presenting, and we're going to be learning about this today. which I'm very much looking forward to. Megan, I reached out to her and asking what's happening, in this area. Tell me a little bit more. And Megan shared information with me about Frontenac Arch Natural Area, and also I know the biosphere. Do we have people from the Frontenac Arch Biosphere Reserve? I'm so excited to learn more about your work. I love biosphere reserves. They do this kind of collaborative work all the time. It's so innate to the way you work. And Staying Connected Initiative. These are all different organizations and ways of contributing to the goals and efforts of A2A. Love this too, the 2 countries, 1 forest. Like this is amazing work. Like it's amazing, incredible work which is taking place in this room by all of you and your colleagues to create the change we need to see across the landscape. I am so grateful to have been asked to come here and learn from you about how to do my work better and how I deliver that with colleagues across the country and globally. So to me, this is where the Global Biodiversity Framework's power comes into play, and it needs to be recognized in how we collectively achieve our work. Ecological connectivity and corridor management delivers on a whole of society and whole of government approach, and I just think we need to continue to be mindful of that as we implement our own work and deliver on the goals that we aim to achieve. And just think about your why and how that has changed over the course of time. So this is my daughter now, again, but I do think about that definition of sustainable development. I didn't understand the significance of that definition when I was starting out my career, really working within a park agency. But this is the bigger thinking that's starting to happen. It's not just about working in a specific park or protected area or on a specific project. It's all interconnected in how we work and relate to one another. So sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So full circle, that report, where that definition came out of, and some of you may remember this, it was from Our Common Future. The purpose of that work was to transform the way we live and operate on the land. Here we are, 35 years later, and we're still figuring that out. But I think we're closer to the answers that we're trying to achieve. And when you look at that map of what has now been protected and conserved and what is getting connected, it looks a lot better than it did 30 years ago. So I am so hopeful for where we're moving. I'm optimistic. I think we need to be. And when it comes to the why I'm optimistic, it's because of the people in this room and the work that continues to grow and our conservation community continues to grow. And I just really want to thank you for allowing me some space to share my own story. And I look forward to learning from all of you for the remainder of today. Thank you.